Here's a point that I bizarrely haven't heard anyone make yet. You cannot adequately plan for a pandemic of any kind if you refuse to first admit that ME and all the other post-viral illnesses are real and then fund research into them appropriately. I believe that long COVID was a preventable tragedy, but I also believe it was an inevitable one. Until we recognize ME and other post-viral illnesses as the serious and common diseases they are, this suffering will just continue on and on. If another pandemic broke out tomorrow, let's call it the X virus pandemic, I think that the exact same thing would happen all over again. People would continue to get sick with post-viral illness, and they probably all get shunted under the label of long X virus syndrome. I think that this would happen for four main reasons. Number one, ME and other post-viral illnesses are stuck in a loop of neglect when it comes to research. There is still no diagnostic test nor any treatment for ME, yet research into the disease continues to be underfunded precisely because we don't know what to measure. Therefore, if the hypothetical X virus broke out tomorrow, no one would want to admit that long X virus is actually just ME and other post-viral illnesses grouped together under a different name, because if they did admit that, then they would also have to admit that long X virus and all personal, psychological, and economic damage that came with it could have been prevented had medical research just been funded appropriately in the first place. I think that admission would simply be too painful for a lot of people. And I also think that for a lot of people who work in the field of medicine and medical research, their planet sized egos would simply never let them admit that they got something so wrong. It would be much easier and less psychologically painful for them to bundle everything under the new name Long X virus and then start research into that from scratch than it would be to admit that these post-viral illnesses already have names, because inventing a new name and distancing it from pre-existing neglected diseases would shield them from their own culpability when it comes to this hypothetical crisis. Number two, the stigma surrounding ME and other post-viral illnesses is so strong that people still doubt if they are even real. If X virus were to break out, and if a lot of people were to get infected at the same time and then be left suffering from the same symptoms in the long term, then it would be really hard for people to convincingly argue that what was happening would be anything other than the mass outbreak of a long-term chronic illness within the population. I think that people would still try to argue that the mystery long-term long X virus syndrome isn't real, but if you had two brain cells to rub together for even just 1 second, then you would quickly come to realize that it makes absolutely no sense for hundreds of millions of people around the globe to just decide to fabricate the exact same set of diseases at the same time. The only explanation that makes sense is if all of these people now have some kind of post-viral illness triggered by the X virus. But even if the symptoms of long X virus were virtually indistinguishable from other post-viral illnesses, why would we say that they are the same thing when post-X virus is very obviously real, and yet ME, POTS, and mast cell activation syndrome are still by and large contested diagnoses? Why would we concede and admit that X virus causes these post-viral illnesses when we doubt that they are real, but we strongly believe that long X virus is real? Number three, post-viral illnesses, and ME in particular, are so poorly taught about that even a lot of people who work in medicine either don't know what they are or aren't confident in diagnosing or treating them. In a world exposed to the X virus, when hordes of people go to visit their doctors when they have long-term symptoms after exposure to the X virus, why would they then be given diagnoses of existing post-viral illnesses when their doctors either don't believe in them, don't know what they are, or aren't confident in treating them? It is doctors, the only people who can give out diagnoses of post-viral illnesses, who will not give out these diagnoses, because doctors are often too lost in the mire of doubt to consider them as an option. Along a similar line, Post-viral illnesses like ME, POTS, and mast cell activation syndrome unfortunately often take years to diagnose. But a world exposed to the X virus would be filled with fear and uncertainty, and people would become sick in terrifying numbers faster than diagnoses of post-viral illnesses could be handed out. In the space of a few years, when everyone is afraid and no one has been given a diagnosis yet, a new diagnosis would be invented to bridge this gap in our explanation of what's going on, and this new diagnosis would be named Long X virus. Finally, number 4, we have to admit to ourselves that it is mostly older white men who hold the top jobs in medicine and medical research, and it is their viewpoints that tend to dominate these fields. Because they hold so much power, how they see the world of medicine through their eyes often ends up becoming how we see the world of medicine too. If these people don't concern themselves with diseases that disproportionately affect women and people of color, then of course they would not connect the dots when the X virus begins to cause long-term illness in large swathes of the population. They already don't know about post-viral illnesses, or they do and they just don't care. So of course they would end up creating a new novel disease, the long X virus, to study instead. Anyways, returning to long COVID, where does it leave us? Let's consider the numbers. A recent report released by scientists and researchers found that globally there are an estimated 400 million people who have long COVID in some form. This report tells us that a mind-blowing 6% of the world's adult population and about 1% of the world's child population have ever had long COVID since the pandemic began. This report also points out that some manifestations of long COVID, including myalgic encephalomyelitis, are chronic conditions that last a lifetime. Not only is this an admission that yes, COVID does just straight up cause ME in some people, but it is also an admission that if you consider the implications of it, makes you realize that we as humanity are in the middle of a global medical catastrophe, and it's one that no one is talking about. The fact that this isn't headline news all the time is part of the medical scandal. There are so fucking many people affected, and yet, just like ME patients before the pandemic, these new long COVID patients have been brutally abandoned by medicine and by society at large. So, why aren't we hearing more about them? It's because they're so ill that they can't tell you about it. I've said it before, we can't march, and it's extremely difficult for us to get organized. We as a patient group are incredibly vulnerable and isolated, and we've pretty much just been left to deal with these horrible illnesses ourselves. It's also because no one really wants to talk about the pandemic. We were all there, and even if you didn't get sick, you still had a horrible time for a good few years, and I get the sense that people just want to move on. But for literally hundreds of millions of us, we can't move on. We're stuck, we're in pain, and on top of that, our misery is being ignored by the media. This dissonance between what we experience and what we see represented, or rather not represented, in the media just amplifies our suffering. It sends us the message that our immense collective suffering is somehow unworthy of attention, that it doesn't matter. And also, if you reacted with hesitation or if you recoiled at all when I said that we're in a global medical catastrophe that no one is talking about, I need you to stop and ask yourself why you reacted that way. Is it because maybe you find it hard to believe that something so awful has been allowed to happen without you even noticing? Do you find it hard to fully admit to yourself the gravity of the situation and how big and expensive this problem will be to fix? Does this scandal undermine your sense of reality? Does this truth shake your trust in society so much that you'd rather ignore it altogether? I think that that kind of thinking is part of this scandal too. The box containing Schrödinger's disease has been up on the shelf for so long that the wood has become rotten and the shelf has collapsed and everything has gone to shit. We can keep the box closed even now, and we can deny the truth, but it won't stop it from being just that. the truth. There really are likely hundreds of millions of people with ME and with other post-viral illnesses who are seriously ill but are hidden away by their own illness and by society's neglect of it. But know this, the world can ignore us with all its might if that's what it wants to do, but the truth won't change. And actually, due to the influence of the pandemic, it's really only a matter of time before this story breaks. And that's what we'll be talking about in our final episodes.